Being a patriot at the time of the Revolution was a real notable thing, given the circumstances around the United States breaking away from Great Britain. I think that being a patriot was noble in the effort to secure freedom from Great Britain, but also economic freedom, which meant a lot to the United States. If you think about when the 4th of July comes around, and you think about when you're being liberated and gaining your independence, I think that made a lot for those individual soldiers.
Wanted to be free from the taxation, and they wanted representation in the elected body. And for a lot of the soldiers, it meant to be able to fight for that freedom, and that liberty was their primary interest and concern.
The Revolutionary War had been going on for 5 years, and Generals Nathaniel Greene and Charles Cornwallis had recently entered the war.
He's known as the Hannibal of the British Army. He was driven. He was cared for by his men. His men thought a great deal of him, and he in turn thought a good deal of his men. He would strive forward to try to defeat Nathaniel Greene's army, but he didn't think out of the box. He kind of had a tunnel vision going.
He had his kind of own way of being stubborn and not necessarily following principal tactics as to say, we know they had a huge Navy.
Well, in the British Army, the cohesiveness of the Army was a family unit. The Army looked after its soldiers, fed them well, educated them to a certain extent, provided cohesiveness of family for the soldiers. And the soldiers, and as Cornwallis was the commander of the Army, he was the head of that family. And so he was looked upon by the soldiers as almost a father figure. And so they wanted to do good for Cornwallis because of that. Well, Tarleton's an interesting character. He was not near as mean as we've made him out through history. He was a very energetic, very young, very abrasive individual. He was lightning quick with his cavalry, and that just scared the bejesus out of the militia and the populace of the countryside. Tarleton was feared in the South. He was a very skilled commander. General Greene was a brilliant organizer. He was a very smart strategist, not the greatest tactician in the world though. But Greene had a philosophy of not losing his army. And this was different from the other generals that had come to the South before, such as Gates and Lincoln, who had lost 2 armies in the South. And General Washington had seen that he could ill afford to lose another army. So he appointed General Greene because Greene was the man who could run his army most like Washington ran his army. Washington's most trusted general. General Greene was a very deep-thinking individual. He could also play the politics. He could get people behind him. He could such as the governor of Virginia, the governor of North Carolina. He would write them letters and request men and supplies and stuff, and would point out the necessity for keeping the Continental Army in the field. So he's a very good organizer, very good.
As Cornwallis said, Greene is as dangerous as Washington. He's a vigilante, enterprising, and full of resources. With but little hope of gaining advantage over him, I've never felt secure when encamped in his neighborhood.
Light Horse Harry Lee was very energetic. He was young. He was ambitious. He was again, like Tarleton, Harry Lee was a brilliant cavalry officer. And when he was put in charge of his legion, he was able to figure out how best to use those men, and which he demonstrated here at the Battle of New Garden. He would show that he had episodes of brilliance. He was lightning fast, and he understood the need for communication. He constantly, between his corps and General Greene, he kept the communication going back and forth. So he was a big help to General Greene. Colonel William Washington, a cousin of George Washington, was another good cavalry commander. He was a heavy rider. He understood tactics. He understood tactics and strategy. If the British had captured the army in the South, then the American army in the South, then the George Washington was running out of soldiers he could afford to send south, because he had to have an army in the north outside of New York City. So the strategy for the British was to defeat each army as it came in contact with it, and capture those men and take them all out of service. And we could ill afford for that to happen.
The British attempt to dislodge New England from the southern colonies had become more difficult than the British had assumed. British Commander-in-Chief Sir Henry Clinton was issued instructions to head south in order to stretch out the American army. A combined attack of British land and naval forces had captured Charlestown, South Carolina. The British now command the largest city and the greatest seaport in the South. General Clinton returns to his base in New York and leaves Lord Cornwallis to hold the post at Charlestown. In September of 1780, General Cornwallis moves north in order to capture North Carolina. The reason for this move is to secure South Carolina, and therefore securing Charlestown as well. Because of its rural, less densely populated areas, it should be harder to defend for the Americans. The other thought on the British general's mind is the higher population of Tories, or British loyalists, which should make for better recruiting.
Cornwallis wanted to expel all of the Patriot forces and Patriot government out of North Carolina, like they had done in South Carolina. So by invading North Carolina, he felt that if he could take over each of the towns and get rid of the court system, which of course was Whig-backed. Then he could instill British sovereignty and British rule again, British authority.
South Carolina, Virginia, all these are neighboring border states, so it would be hard to invade North Carolina with the existence of all these local militias. I think that made it difficult, and then just the terrain in North Carolina at that particular time, it wasn't easy to invade.
On the American side, General Greene took command of the Southern Campaign on December 3rd, 1780, near Charlotte, North Carolina. Out of the 2,307 men he took under his command, about 800 of them were properly able for battle. The rest of the men were either ill-equipped, sick with diarrhea or other illnesses that had plagued them due to malnourishment.
Oh, he wrote that they were naked and distressed. They were almost the shadow of an army. They were without supplies. Their morale was just terrible, and they had suffered defeat at Camden in August, and they didn't have enough men to have a pitched battle. So Greene went to work feeding the army, clothing the army, supplying the army with weapons and equipment, and then trying to drum up the militia and to ask for more Continentals from General Washington. So Greene had his hands full when he took command of the army because they were in such bad shape.
Primarily farmers, but these men needed some extra training, so they weren't at the top that he thought that they thought they would be. So he had to do some additional training, and then he had, at that particular time, he still had to recruit more men to get them strategically prepared for war. He got a lot of that leadership from Washington, so he was able to prepare his men and their mindset for warfare. Because, you know, given the state of, you know, Great Britain and their arms and stuff, they still had to do additional training. And, you know, I mean, because think about it, if you're recruiting local militias, most of those people are farmers or either, you know, shoemakers or anything like that. So it's going to take far more training to train them to just, you know, hand them a gun and let's say just go to combat.
Greene decides to move his army southeast to Shore Hall in South Carolina, while he sends General Morgan with 1,000 Delaware Continentals, as well as some militia, to move along the Catawba River. It compels my adversary to divide his army and holds him in doubt of his own line of conduct. He cannot leave Morgan behind and come at me, or his posts at 96 Augusta will be exposed. And he cannot chase Morgan and prosecute his views upon Virginia while I am here with the whole country open before me. I am as near to Charlestown as he is. General Nathaniel Greene.
Greene, in defiance of military convention, split his army as he faced a superior army. And Greene went to Cheraw Hills in South Carolina with the sicklier soldiers of his army, and to try to allow them to get well and strengthened up and rested. And he gave the stronger soldiers to Daniel Morgan, with orders from Morgan to head to the west and see about threatening those western outposts. And so Cornwallis sent Tarleton to the west too, with his soldiers.
Cornwallis did divide his army, sending Lieutenant Bannister Tarleton with 1,500 men on a mission to destroy Morgan's troops, Both Cornwallis and Tarleton thought this would be an easy victory. At the place known as Hannah's Cowpens, Morgan led Tarleton into a trap, nearly crushing his army.
Lost for the British, it lost 800 men, which they could ill afford to lose because it knocked them down to where Cornwallis only had about 2,000 effectives in the field. And it was a brilliant American victory for Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan, matter of fact, he set the 3 lines at Cowpens, and it was so successful that when Greene was setting his army here, Morgan kept saying, "You got to do the 3 lines, you got to do the 3 lines." And of course, Greene did do the 3 lines here. When Cornwallis lost those 800 men at the Cowpens, immediately Daniel Morgan took off with them to take them to the prison camps for the American side.
After the loss at Cowpens, Cornwallis did not give up his pursuit on Morgan. His goal was to crush Morgan's unit, regain momentum, and collect the soldiers that were captured at Cowpens. He raced through North Carolina, sometimes marching 20 miles in one day. At one point, he was so desperate, he burned his baggage in order to be lighter.
Lord Cornwallis immediately took out after them in a mad dash to try to get those men back, but the Americans moved too fast with them, so he couldn't get those men back. That kind of shows you how important those men were to him. Cowpens was a terrible defeat for the British. Lord Cornwallis wrote in a letter following the battle that the late affair has broke his heart. And it was a brilliant American victory. But again, after the battle, General Morgan had to go on to retreat because Cornwallis was marching with his whole army to try to catch up with Morgan. And of course, that was the race to the Dan, and he never did catch him. Troops on a light infantry footing or living off the land. And that was pretty bad, being that he was as far away from his supply depots, Camden, Charleston, Wilmington, as he was. So he had really taken on a big problem, and it got worse by the actions that he did.
Cornwallis's goal was to trap Morgan at the Dan River. Greene had already planned for this. He ordered boats to be collected from locals. By the skin of their teeth, Morgan's men crossed the river, avoiding Cornwallis. Greene did not believe he had enough troops to hold up against Cornwallis. The Guilford Courthouse area was the best turnout for militia. Most of his men were now made up of militia.
The population in the South, in these southern states, is where the South had advantage in terms of local militias. And local militias were very critical to the American Revolution.
He didn't know if he had enough troops. Now, he had plenty of militia, but he only had the 1,400 or so Continentals with him. The militia provided a large segment of the American Army. They were, for one thing, they showed support for the Patriot cause. For another, by coming out and fighting, they showed support for the Continentals that were in the field. And that's what they were. They were a support organization. Think of the Continentals as the core organization of the regulars in which you would build your army around. And so the militia would come in and act as the support organization of the Continentals.
Greene knew that many of his men's enlistments were to be at their end. He knew timing was of the essence.
General Greene had been itching for a fight even the month before in February when he was here, but his officers had talked him out of it. By the time he had gathered all his troops here at Guilford Courthouse, he had pretty much demonstrated that he was ready to fight and there would be some action. The British were again chasing the American army, and they were marching so fast from Deep River to get here because they didn't know if Greene would take off on the run again. So they force marched all the way here and then went right into the battle, which was saying a lot. They got up at 5 a.m. and marched from Deep River to here before they fought. That's about 9 miles. And then they fought the Battle of New Garden, and then they came here and they fought this battle. So they were well trained. Those British were well trained, and their morale, as I said, they were looking for a fight. They were ready to defeat Greene's army and end this thing.
With the recruits from North Carolina and Virginia, Greene had a total of 4,400 men, facing 2,200 redcoats. This was now a battle of quality versus quantity. The morning of the 15th, Light Horse Harry Lee rode to New Garden Meeting House, about 3 miles east. His intent was to keep Tarleton at bay, away from the battle.
He was trying to slow the British Army down. They were on the road to this place. Greene knew they were coming. Light Horse Harry Lee was just trying to slow the British Army down to give Greene more time to set his lines and get ready for the British. Light Horse Harry Lee probably had it in mind that he could defeat Tarleton in a pitched battle at New Garden, and certainly from his actions at New Garden, he thought he did when he had, after the first battle skirmish in that area, and Tarleton went on the retreat, and then Light Horse Harry Lee went to try to cut him off from reaching the British Army. Light Horse Harry Lee thought he was going to capture Tarleton. But unfortunately, the British Army, the main part of the British Army, came up, and Light Horse Harry Lee couldn't capture Tarleton.
After Cornwallis's army came behind Tarleton's line, Lee retreated back to Guilford Courthouse. The action was sharp and bravely maintained on both sides. Light Horse Harry Lee. Greene decided to use Guilford Courthouse as the place to stand and fight. Greene did decide to take Morgan up on his suggestion to use the 3 lines like Morgan did at Cowpens. His first line, made up of North Carolina militiamen, set up to the right of New Garden Road, was General Thomas Eaton. Brigadier General John Butler was set up to the left of New Garden Road.
The North Carolina militia was very much to the other extreme, untrained. There was very little militia training that took place in the colonial times. Maybe once a year they'd have a militia muster where they were supposed to be trained in their use of the firearms. But even that, the militia firearms were rifles and shotguns and Fowlers and smoothbore guns of various types. So nobody had the same firearm. So you couldn't really train them to shoot and fire at the same time as you would with everybody being armed with a musket. So the militia for the North Carolinians were not trained that well. The American officers, the militia officers, did the best they could, but training really was lax.
You can say it in a sense because these people are not educated, so you're not really sure that they're going to fight for a cause. But I think what Nathaniel Greene did, I think he trained them, and then he was picking which battle, when and time to attack. You know, because you can't go and attack somebody if everybody's not on one accord.
On the left wing of the line was Colonel Washington's 1st and 3rd Virginia Regulars. Captain Robert Kirkwood's detachment, made up of about 40 Delaware and Continentals and 200 riflemen, led by Colonel Charles Lynch. On the other flank, Colonel Light Horse Harry Lee had 75 cavalrymen and 8 light infantry, along with Major Reed's detachment and Colonel William Campbell's 250 riflemen.
The rifle in its day was considered not the primary weapon of choice because it took a minute to load and it didn't fit a bayonet. So you had no way to defend yourself if a person with a musket came up to you. And the rifles were used by the American riflemen and the Hessian Jaegers. The rifles were used to pick off men at great distances. They were pretty accurate up to about 300 yards. Without having a whole army of riflemen, then we just had small groups of riflemen. They weren't that effective in the field. You could hit what you were aiming at, but the slowness in trying to load and the lack of defense capabilities made them an anomaly of such. At this battle, there were the Jaegers, the Lynch's riflemen, and William Campbell's riflemen on the American side. The Jaegers were on the British side, of course.
In the center of all this, on New Garden Road, were Captain Anthony Singleton's 2 6-pounder cannons, which Lee had commented were most advantageously posted.
It's heavy, so you talking about, you know, that type of cannon. You talking about 4 and 5 men, you know, manning a cannon. That's huge because, like I said, it took more manpower. At that particular time, it took more manpower to man those cannons than talking about 5 or 6 men. And then you still have flanks of infantry, so that takes from, you know, the body count. You had to heavily recruit because you had to have that technology ran off of manpower.
Pretty accurate up to about 400 yards. They would fire the solid balls. They would fire the grape shot, which are balls about that big, and then they would fire the case shot, which are balls about the size of a musket ball. And they all had different reasons for firing. For instance, you would fire grape shot at horses, at the cavalry, because they were the bigger balls and bring the horses down. And you would fire the case shot, more like musket balls, at the infantry. And then you had the solid shot, which didn't do that much damage being shot against infantry, but if you're firing at militia, one of those cannonballs hitting some militia guy, that's going to do a world of fear for the rest of your militia standing around seeing what happens.
Guilford was in the wilderness at the time, and the road to Salisbury was the only open way from the clearing of the first line to the envious of the courthouse. The forest of lofty oaks gave wood protection to the second line, made up of Virginia militias, numbering in the 1100s.
300 yards east of the first line was the second line, made up of Virginia militiamen. To the right of New Garden Road was General Stevens' Virginia Militia Brigade. To the left of New Garden Road was Lawson's Brigade.
The second line, the Virginia line, was a little more cohesive during the battle because they did have that training. And a lot of the officers were former Continental soldiers too. So you had that combination of previous military training. It made a difference here at this battle.
Most experienced men were the Continentals. This would be the third line of defense for the Americans. From right to left were Ford's 2nd Maryland Regiment, Gunby's 1st Maryland Regiment, Hawes' Virginia Regiment, Singleton's 2 6-pounder cannons, Colonel Green's Virginia Regiment. We are at this moment marching to attack Cornwallis with a force which I am in hopes is full able to cope with him. Virginian Sergeant George Tucker.
Morgan was that the three lines would support each other. The first line would fight, and then the second line could come up and support that line, and then the third line could come up and support that line. The problem with that here is that the lines were so far apart that the lines couldn't support each other. So he used Daniel Morgan's model, but he didn't of setting the three lines, but he didn't use it in actual movement of the troops. He wanted to fight a defense in depth position, or having first line and the enemy attacks it, and then have the second line where the enemy has to attack it, and the third line where the enemy has to attack it. That's the strategy he was using here at this battle, which is a little different from Morgan at Cowpens. He put his cavalry and his infantry and his riflemen on both flanks, and light infantry too, to protect against any way in which Tarleton can come around the flanks and descend upon the militia.
On the British line, from left to right in the front, Webster's 472 men placed to the left of New Garden Road. To the right of New Garden Road, the 71st Highlanders Regiment. The Von Boos Regiment, to the right of that, was made up of about 565 men. The Von Boos Regiment were made up of Hessians, or German mercenaries. The supporting line, behind the front line, which would later be the flank and extension of the British line, were Yeager's men on the left, the Guards' light infantry to the left of New Garden Road. To the right of New Garden Road were O'Hara's 2nd Battalion Guards, and to the right of O'Hara, Norton's 1st Battalion Guards. Coming up New Garden Road, behind them were Tarleton's light infantry.
Oh man, they were the best army in Western civilization. The average British soldier was about 24 or 25 years old, as opposed to the average Continental, which was about 19. The British soldiers were veterans. The regiments that all fought here had all fought in the north in the northern campaign battles. And so they were well trained. They were trained in the use of the bayonet, and they were not going anywhere. The deserters and the shirkers had long disappeared by the time of this battle. So the British regiments that fought here were all well trained. I could go down the list, but suffice to say, the 33rd Regiment of Foot, for instance, was Cornwallis's own regiment. So you know they weren't going to run. And the British Guards, they were the household guards from London. You know they weren't going to run. Well, General Greene picked this field. He actually came here in February of 1781 and decided he wanted to fight on this field because of the three ridge lines. And he liked what he saw. There's something about this field that he liked. When his officers talked him out of it, he left the field. And then when he came back, he came right back to this place when he came back from Virginia to actually have a fight. He had picked this field. So whether it's the three ridge lines that he could put the three lines on, or whether it's the open field around the courthouse or the open field around the first line, he never wrote down exactly what the biggest reason for picking this field was. But certainly he had a lot of tactical advantages for picking this field.
It was fought on the 15th day of March 1781, a day never to be forgotten by the southern sections of the United States.
The British marched up New Garden Road through Little Horsepen Creek, woods, and muddy fields. Cornwallis knew little of the terrain around the area.
It was rough terrain, very rough. And they had to march across the creek and then march uphill through the woods until they got to the open fields. And when they got to the open fields, they were muddy and deep with mud. And so they had to cross the open fields in the mud, which of course slowed them down tremendously.
Creeks in the woods, they weren't used to that type of terrain, so they just figured they were gonna, go through there very quickly. But with creeks and woods and stuff like that, you gotta understand that, like I said, they weren't used to outside terrain. So that made it difficult for them to proceed to find out what they actually were getting into, because it's like stuff was covered up when you start talking about the geographical location of North Carolina.
Around noon, the American first line could see the British marching up New Garden Road. Captain Singleton wasted little time opening fire with his two 6-pounder cannons. The British responded with their 3-pounder cannons. The British marched through 400 yards of open field. When they got to within 140 yards of the American first line, they had their arms presented and resting on a rail fence. They were taking aim with the nicest precision. Sergeant Robert Lamb of the Royal Welch Fusileers.
Roger Lamb states that the British Army was frozen almost, and Brigadier General Webster rode out in front of them and yelled, "Come on, my brave Fusiliers." And with that broke the frozenness of the line, and they charged forward. That the American line was sitting there with their rifles and muskets resting on the fence rail, taking a more deliberate aim. And when he writes about it, you can almost read the fear in his voice that there was no way out of this mess. They were going to fire off, and they did. They fired off 1,100 firearms at one time, and so many soldiers really were cut down in that first line. So it was, and you're standing in an open muddy field and you can't move very good, and you've got somebody aiming at you from across the field with just all day just taking his deliberate aim and then pulling that trigger. So it had to be scary.
Fire! Fire!
The British came to within 50 yards of the Americans, fired a volley, and charged with bayonets. Being that many of the North Carolina militia were inexperienced, they fled, dropping guns and equipment along the way. The flanks of riflemen, however, held firm.
When these farmers and people in the militia were standing up here at the first and second line and facing that British Army, they knew that that British Army was coming for them and that they weren't going to run. So a lot of the Americans said, "The heck with this, I'm going home." Very scary for them. The unknown, of course, is always a scary factor. The idea that you're standing up against the best army in Western civilization, the idea that you don't have a bayonet, you are out in the field with 1,100 other people, and you're not operating as one army, you're operating as 1,100 individuals. So, which in 18th century warfare was a death trap.
Percentage of them probably were pretty low. I mean, because the fact that, you know, I don't know what it's like to fight against a British soldier. Well, British had a long-standing army. They had a huge navy. They basically controlled everything at this time. So, yeah, if I'm in their position, yeah, I would be very fearful because I don't know what's to come.
The British extended the line to outflank the Americans. At this point, the riflemen and cavalry pulled back to the second line. In the confusion of the wilderness, Lee's cavalry and Campbell's riflemen retreated southeast, missing their designated retreat point, as they were chased by Norton's 1st Battalion Guards. This took men away from both sides of the fighting. The second line was given orders to break ranks in order to let the North Carolina militia through.
Got that unknown factor again, that you don't know exactly what went on. All you know is that these people are running back through the woods towards you and running through your lines.
As the British moved through the wilderness, hurtle over brush, and weave between trees, the lines become more extended and broken up. This made for confusion, lack of communication, and a less united British front.
As they were going through the woods, these were old growth woods with heavy underbrush. So the British had to, they couldn't keep their formations of their lines. Their communication from one regiment to the next was non-existent because of the separation, because of the woods. So it was very difficult for them to maintain their British lines.
British at this particular time, you know, were very cocky, you know, and that's the way Lord Cornwallis instilled in his men. It was hard for them as well. It was hard for Nathaniel Greene and his men, but Nathaniel Greene and his men were, I think they were a little bit more protected in the fact the way he staged the whole battle.
The second line was more heavily engaged, and being that they were more experienced, they held out longer. On the extreme right, the British nearly broke ranks. We fired on their flank, and that brought down many of them. We pursued them about 40 poles to the top of the hill, where they stood, and we retreated back to where we were from. Sam Houston, of the Virginia Militia. A unit of Americans took cover upon a hill, firing down on the British and taking cover behind the hill to reload. The British charged the hill only to be pushed back by yet another militia unit when the von Bu's regiment of Hessians advanced to reinforce the guards.
Rockbridge County, Virginia militia were, and they were fighting the redcoats, and they looked off to their flank and they saw these bluecoats coming their way. So they naturally thought they were Americans, and they took off their hats and went running to them yelling, "Liberty, liberty, liberty," and the Hessians fired at them and answered their call with a Hessian volley. And with that, Rockbridge County militia then formed back up and moved back into the woods some more, away from the Hessians. They were in a small retreat pattern. They would have a firefight, and they would fight, but they would slowly pull back, and they slowly pulled back until Brigadier General Stevens was wounded, and after he went down, then the rest of the second line disappeared.
The brigade behaved with the greatest bravery and stood till I ordered their retreat. General Stevens. Not being able to attack to the front, the Fusiliers were obligated to take ground to their left to get clear of the brushwood. They then attacked the enemy with the bayonet in too cool and deliberate a manner as to throw the Americans into the greatest confusion and disperse them. The second line now fully retreated. The British now moved uphill to face the third line of fighting. The third line of fighting was the closest, heaviest, and most intense. Nathaniel Slade of North Carolina watched from the courthouse. The conflict between the Brigade of Guards and the 1st Regiment of Marylanders was most terrific, for they fired at the same instant, and they appeared so near that the blades from the muzzles of their guns seemed to meet.
Hand to hand, one muskets, bayonets, swords, tomahawks.
On the American left flank, 2nd Maryland fired a weak volley and retreated out of panic, causing the British to sweep over the hillside, taking the left flank and rear of the Americans.
You could have two avenues of escape from the third line field, and if they weren't able to go off the direction that they did, they would have just gone off in another direction. That was Greene once again trying to maintain his regulars in the field.
They also captured 4 6-pounder guns. Seeing this from a distance, Colonel William Washington ordered a charge into the British right flank, taking them by surprise. Leaping the ravine, the swords of the horsemen were upon the enemy, who were rejoicing in victory and safety. And before they suspected danger, multitudes lay dead.
It was William Washington that, here at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, that took it upon himself to charge the British Guards, which was a pretty daring act, because if it had gone wrong, then he would have been blamed for it. but he decided upon himself to halt the British attack at the third line by charging his cavalry into it without orders.
My men followed very quickly, and we pressed through the guards, many of whom had been knocked down by the horse without being much hurt. We took some prisoners, and the whole were within our power. Colonel Howard, 1st Maryland. General Cornwallis, seeing the charge and fearing the loss of battle, orders artillery commander Lieutenant McLeod to bring his cannons forward and fire a grape shot into the mix of British Guards and American Continentals.
Well, Cornwallis writes in his report that he ordered the grape shot to be fired into the American cavalry. And unfortunately, because of where the cavalry was at, the grape shot went through the cavalry and hit the fighting troops behind the cavalry, both British and American, that were in the line of fire. So Cornwallis was trying to prevent his staff and the artillery from being captured by the American cavalry. So it was really about all he could do. The alternative was not to fire and to surrender his staff and the artillery to the American cavalry. And if Cornwallis had been captured, it would have been over for the British in the South. You're like 95% water, so it's like hitting a water balloon or something. And the grape shot will make a pretty good sized hole in you, probably something like that. Matter of fact, the grape shot fired here at the third line hit Lieutenant Fauntleroy right in the chest and killed him instantly. He was the lead cavalryman on the American charge there at the third line.
Not too long after the shot was fired, the Americans realized the momentum had shifted back to the British. One by one, the units retreated to safety.
I'd love to get it.
The Americans retreated from battle to Ready Fork Creek. The British, too wounded and tired from battle, did not pursue the Americans.
Immediately after the battle, as he's retreating, he's realizing that he's losing the battle because, of course, he's retreating from the field. And immediately he had this attitude of, I don't know what I've lost. I've lost, the militia's fled. I'm missing some of my Continentals. I'm missing Henry Lee. I'm missing, and his Legion. I'm missing. So he didn't know what he had lost at first. But then as the reports came in later and he saw, and the Continentals all showed back up to camp, he saw that he wasn't missing that much. And then he heard about the British casualties, and then he became elated.
Cornwallis sent a message to Greene concerning his wounded. Send immediately surgeons to take care of them, and the supplies necessary and provisions. Cornwallis commandeered wagons, 4 6-pounder cannons, ammunition, prisoners, and food which his men so badly needed. The loss, however, was devastating. Cornwallis set out for Wilmington for provisions and reinforcements. He then invaded Virginia in hopes that he would have better luck. However, his luck ran out when the French fleet arrived to entrap the British at Yorktown. This was the end of the Southern campaign for the British Army.
Had told Cornwallis that his biggest job was to protect those provinces and keep them under royal authority. Cornwallis didn't do that. Cornwallis, when he invaded North Carolina, he left South Carolina open. After the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, when he went on to retreat to Wilmington, he just left South Carolina open to General Greene's attack of South Carolina and Georgia. And so Greene spent the next 6 months slowly pushing the British out of those two provinces. And there was a big argument between Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis at the end of the Revolution about who lost the Revolution for him. It's almost like this was the high water mark of the Southern campaign. Everything prior to it, he's on the move and the aggressor. Everything after it, he's on the defense and the defensive. So that's strategically the real importance of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Boy, we covered just about all of it, I think.